Hello and welcome back, and today I'm doing something just a little bit different. I actually live streamed the process of me drawing this a couple days ago on my channel, but I liked the finished product so much that I thought I would turn it into a speed drawing. And with the news that recently came out about the Kyoto animation studio, it caught fire, several people died, and it was a really tragic thing. They were the studio that created the movie A Silent Voice, and that's one of my favorite movies of all time. So I was very much struck by the urge to draw for it again, just to kind of keep the memory alive and pay tribute, I guess, to what a beautiful piece of animation this is. So I decided to draw this scene where Nishimiya and Ishida are on the bridge and they're talking to each other right after the climax of the movie. I really wanted to do something that was like ethereal looking because the scene is stunning, don't get me wrong at all, but I think in a still image I could really play up the lighting and do something really, really beautiful with the sky in the background. And because I was live streaming this, there were a couple things that were different. The first of which is I actually did all the work making the sky before I started live streaming, and I also did several layers of sketches before I started live streaming. And it was while I was drawing that I thought, maybe I'll just try it out, see if people want to hang out while I'm drawing. So it was really fun. I had a great time just listening to music and really focusing on drawing for a couple hours. And I'm just so proud of how it turned out in the end. I stole a lot of the colors directly from the scene, but I do go over them with a lot of different kinds of shading and overlays and light layers that give them a kind of different look. I was just trying to keep the whole color palette really cohesive because I was worried if I started picking colors myself that I might go too far off the rails in any one direction. I still wanted these characters to look like themselves. One of the harder parts of this drawing was the background. I'm still learning when it comes to backgrounds, very much so. So doing something like this that isn't organic, I guess, it leaves less room for mistakes, in my opinion. It's a little bit harder to justify a line that's not straight or something that's not symmetrical, because in nature, having things that are asymmetrical is actually lending to the realism of the drawing, because nothing in nature is really super duper 100% symmetrical because it's natural, it's organic. But in terms of man-made structures, it would be fairly symmetrical looking, but not too symmetrical, because if it's too symmetrical, you lose some of the energy that's in the drawing. Symmetry provides stability, and stability isn't necessarily a bad thing, In some places you really want something to look stable, but stability also lacks energy because it lacks movement. Even in a static image like this, there's movement. There's the shape of the lines, how they taper on the edge, even the way I shade, the way it's colored. There's a lot of movement in the illustration. So having that background be perfectly symmetrical, I felt, would be a disservice, and especially when I add the plants near the end of the drawing that are kind of like potted plants that hang over the edge of the bridge. They add a certain degree of asymmetry that I really think naturalizes the background a little bit. I'm never quite sure how much detail to put into the background because I don't want to be spending 18 hours drawing the background. That's just a little bit excessive for me, at least. I like to put a lot of effort into the foreground characters, but I'm not quite sure how to make a background that doesn't feel either too simple or too complicated, because at the moment, at least in this image, I feel like you have a really organic looking sky, really organic looking characters, and then a very much man-made structure in the middle. So in order to make that structure look a little bit more cohesive with the rest of the drawing, I have to make it look a little bit more organic, which really comes in with the shading. The shading is not going to be very smooth like the lines are for the edges. And there's also like some stains on the wood where it would have eroded away from being wet, or some chunks chipped out of the concrete pieces that they're sitting in front of. I'm basically just, right now, I'm not really talking about what I'm doing word for word because, you know, I do a lot of the same thing in a lot of my drawings in the background, so I figured I would try and talk more about the process than necessarily tell you exactly what's happening on screen. But I really wanted to make these trees in the background look cohesive with the sky. And the sky definitely has this purpley tinge, which I thought would be excellent because the bridge, the building in the background, they have that purpley color. So I didn't make the trees very saturated at all. They're very desaturated purple. And I think that helps them not necessarily blend in, but just not feel out of place. And I added a blur on both the trees that are kind of closer to the characters and further away. Obviously the ones that are further away are blurred more to give that illusion of depth. Here I am, I'm using a pastel brush to try and chalk in the concrete because again, I'm not really sure how much detail to put into it, but I do know that any concrete ever that's a little worn in is going to have chunks taken out of it, some light spaces, some dark spaces. And I watched a tutorial a while back about how to create rocks, and it had this kind of like build in both directions. Start with a mid-tone and then go lighter, go darker, go lighter, go darker, and use both big chunks and little chunks to really convey the texture of the rock. It's a little bit different with these ones because they are man-made. They're not, natural structures. So the difference in the shape is going to be a little bit less intense than it would probably be for like a canyon or a boulder. Because these came from molds, they're just barely going to have a little bit of change in them. And if they were brand new, there's got to be some kind of way to provide texture. But it would look a little bit out of place with this drawing, I think, to have it be just a straight up perfect looking concrete block. The ones on the side I didn't add too much texture to because I can't actually tell if they're wood or if they're concrete. I think they're concrete, but I'm not sure. And this flooring, originally the flooring had tiles on it, and I did try that, but I didn't like how much effort it was taking to my return on effort, It was taking too much effort to be worth my time. So instead I just kind of do this illusion of bricks using a dark color and just sort of blending it towards the viewer. And I think that really, with all the overlays and stuff on top, it works in a way that didn't take a lot of time. It was simple and the amount of detail doesn't distract from the characters, which is another thing that's really hard to balance in terms of creating a background, is if your background is too detailed, your characters are not going to stand out. They're going to get lost in this big giant wash of background. So either using lighting, using detail, using saturation, something along those lines has to really make the characters pop. And I think the two big pops in this drawing were the characters and the sky. And that's okay, because the sky and characters are very clearly in related but different color palettes. It works very, very well between them. The bars on the edge of the bridge, I wasn't sure how much detail I wanted to put into them. Once again, it's a difficult thing to try and balance because I wanted to make it look like there were light and shadows in this bridge, but I didn't want to spend the time necessarily to go through each and every one and make sure the lighting was exactly correct. I just don't think that it's worth it to do that when you're trying to get a illustration out on time. If you have all the time in the world, yeah, you can go in and add as much detail as you want, but I was live streaming at the time, so I didn't want people to just be sitting there and wondering what I'm doing because I've spent 15 minutes on one pole of a bridge. So as you can see, I'm adding in the foliage now, I still can't say that word, the leaves. But I made sure to kind of texture up the background that they were on top of, just in case you could see through them, you would see texture and not just blank purple. I wanted to add a little bit of something extra, and because I saw that there were flowers in the background of the original, I add all these little purple flowers, but again, I want them to be so non-detailed, so totally non-detailed, that they could just completely blend into the background, but when you look at them, you kind of go, oh, that's an interesting little detail, you know? Something to keep you looking a little bit longer, but not be distracted. So, I don't know why I'm having so much trouble with it lately. After my first silent voice video where I used the wet blender, I thought this would be another great opportunity to use that wet blender and kind of give it a dreamy, smoky look. But for some reason, I don't know, just the way the wet blender is blending out is kind of gross and muddy, and it must be something to do with the color that I'm picking, because I know that it blends out beautifully sometimes, but I just can't exactly figure out what is making it so grayish. It might just be the fact that I need to pick a little bit more of a lighter, more saturated color rather than a darker and less saturated color in order for it to blend out more cohesively with the palette. I don't think it looks terrible, but I just wasn't really happy with how muddy it was looking. And I think I was a little more okay with the muddiness last time because they were underwater. It was really ethereal. You don't know where the shading is coming from, really. So I decide to leave that as is for now, but I was doing a more standard cell shading on the Nishimiya character, just to sort of compare and contrast them and see which one I liked better with this piece. And I really thought the wet blending would work well with this piece because I blended a lot of things in the background, you know? Most of the shadows are blended, the concrete, the wood, it's all blended stuff, but it just was not working, so I might have to look up a tutorial on how to use that a little bit more effectively. So for now I just went with a pretty standard cell shade. I softened it out a little bit on the edges, but I liked the way the cell shading was looking on Nishimiya, so I did the same on Ishida. And I really wanted it to be kind of a dramatic lighting. You can't see the moon in this image, so I imagine it's coming from Ishida's back from the right-hand side of the drawing. And that's partially because I didn't want to distract from all the cool nebulous stuff going on in the galaxy, and partially just because I didn't want to have to backlight the characters, because if I backlit them, a lot of their front half would be in shadow, obviously. And if it was in shadow, I really didn't want it getting lost among the background elements. So I added this first overlay, which I thought was really cool, like a nice purpley thing, made everything a little more coherent, made it look more at night. And I add a soft light layer on one side so that it looks like the light is coming from that direction. And then I do a little bit of highlighting on the back of their clothes and add a second overlay just to really dramatize the shadows and light, show that it's like a strong light cast. And I go back and mess a little bit with this background here, add some more light spots, some more dark spots, just really having fun with it. Oh, I love, love, love doing these nebulous background things. I love them so much. I think they're beautiful, and they really add something special to the drawing. I do a little bit of color dodge lighting on some of the leaves just to bring them forward a little bit, and I figure Nishimiya probably needs a heavier shadow behind her, so I add that. And this is pretty much where the drawing is almost done. I'm just adding little details like highlights in their hair and on their clothing. I really just wanted them to look like they were bathed in a sort of beautiful, beautiful moonlight. And I thought because they looked so ethereal, I might try again with a clipping mask and color their line art. And it worked wonderfully. So now I think I understand a little bit more about how clipping masks work. But I think it gave it like this really soft, really interesting glow to it. So that's basically it. Thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video, give me a thumbs up and maybe consider subscribing. Have a wonderful day and all that jazz.